the Democratic Alliance believes that the decision made by Mr. Fraser is unlawful for at least two reasons. First, it was taken against the recommendation of the Medical Parole Advisory Board not to grant medical parole to Mr. Zuma. Second, it was taken for an ulterior purpose not permitted by Section 79 of the Correctional Services Act and Regulations, which govern the granting of medical parole in South Africa. And it was not rationally connected to the purpose of medical parole or the information before the Commissioner. Mr. Zuma was imprisoned for contempt of court so serious that it constituted a near existential threat to the authority of the judicial system in South Africa. In the words of the court, and I quote, "Indeed, if we do not intervene immediately to send a clear message to the public that this conduct stands to be rebuked in the strongest of terms, there's a real and imminent risk that a mockery will be made of this court and the judicial process in the eyes of the public. The vigor with which Mr. Zuma is peddling his disdain of the court and the judicial process carries the further risk that he will inspire or incite others to similarly defy this court, the judicial process, and the rule of law," unquote. Mr. Fraser's parole decision harms the court in exactly the same way as Mr. Zuma's original defiance and contempt of the court did. It again makes a mockery of the judicial processes and sends a very clear message to South Africa that if you're politically connected, you don't need to worry, because there's a different set of rules for the ANC and their cadres and another set of rules for the people of South Africa. It is a terrible indictment too on the President that he not only failed to speak out against this egregious decision, but in fact he openly welcomed it. When the President stood on the steps to take the oath of office, he swore to uphold the Constitution and all other law of the Republic. The Commission's, the Correctional Services Act and Regulations are laws of the Republic. It is very, very clear he facilitated this as well by deploying Mr. Fraser into the Correctional Services Department in the first place, knowing full well Mr. Fraser's allegations and charges hanging over his head from his time as a State Security Agency head, and having those confirmed when the high-level panel report by Mr. Mufamadi was tabled with him, and has kept Mr. Fraser in this position. And it's become very clear why Mr. Fraser has been kept in these positions, just like every other person deployed into the civil service through the ANC's evil cadre deployment policy that has caused so much damage in South Africa. The ulterior purpose of placing Mr. Zuma on medical parole was to solve a political problem for Mr. Ramaphosa. He knows that the elections are now 7 weeks away. He knows that the structures in KwaZulu-Natal were in open revolt against him and his faction in the ANC and were refusing to work on the ground in this election, and therefore there was a political imperative to ensure that Mr. Zuma was released so that he could participate in the ANC's election campaign. The President therefore continues to put his party's interests against the interests of justice and the rule of law and the principle of equality before the law at tremendous risk. So we will be using every means at our disposal to ensure that the rule of law in South Africa and the principle of equality before the law is upheld. This is an important principle. A constitutional democracy cannot exist without these fundamental, foundational principles of the rule of law and equality before it. It is the ANC's policy of cadre deployment that has allowed and facilitated this. And since 1998, the Democratic Alliance warned what the outcome of the cadre deployment policy would be, and we are now sitting with the consequences of that policy. The fact that we have people like Mr. Fraser, who can in no means say that he was dispassionate or that he did not have a political imperative in overriding the sound medical advice of the Medical Parole Board to provide political cover to Mr. Zuma and to the ANC. We obviously hope that the court will agree with our position and see the imperative of upholding the principle of the rule of law and equality before it, as well as the fact that the judicial process has been mocked through this medical parole. Thanks very much.